Hello, this is another recording in the series on, this one it's sort of halfway between the series I've been doing on Druidry and the series I've been doing on general paganism, because it involves a bit of everything. What I'd like to talk about today, whilst I'm in the kitchen once again, and this time making fudge. What I want to talk about is the issue of offerings, the making of offerings. The giving of sacrifices, if you like, although offerings and sacrifices aren't necessarily one and the same thing. Some people use them to mean slightly different things from each other. Partly this is because of a recent situation that has cropped up. I was contacted by the police force recently, the local police force, because somebody, I don't know who or why for that matter, but somebody had unearthed near a local spring a set of offerings that had been made, runes, siaks, various little bits and pieces that had been buried in this spring, all together, and therefore presumably by the same person. Whether they buried them all at the same time or they had gone back for repeat journeys to the same spot over a period of time, I just don't know. But that they didn't look as if they had been in the ground for a particularly long period of time. But anyway, someone else had come along and dug them up, and possibly because one of the items in there was a dagger, they had taken them along to the police. And the police had looked at these objects and realised that they were a religious offering, which itself is really very, very impressive and shows how far we have come as a community. That the local police are sufficiently familiar with interfaith issues that someone on that force looked at the runes and little Gullinbursti and all sorts of other things that were in there, and clocked that this was a heathen deposit. So they had got on to the Pagan Police Association, who had looked at them and said, yes, this is indeed some kind of ritual deposit. And they'd asked around here and there and had not been able to identify, we still haven't identified the exact person who put them in. But the upshot was that the Pagan Police Association put them in touch with me, as the closest thing to a responsible adult they could find, which is a bit worrying. And the police had said, this is a religious offering, it's not a criminal issue, it's a religious interment. We can't put it back in the same spot because there is a dagger, and potentially, I suppose, somebody somewhere might dig it up and misuse it or whatever. So they felt it had to be dealt with by someone who understood the religious context, rather than just some local constable going back up to the spring with a shovel, slinging them in the ground and forgetting about them. So I collected the items from the station and have tried to find, so I haven't succeeded in finding out who put them in there. So I haven't been able to ascertain the kind of circumstances that they would like those items to be disposed of in. But given that they were placed near a spring, I have put them near another spring in a spot that no one is likely to dig up again. So hopefully they will stay there for a long, long time, and maybe confuse the hell out of some archaeologist in 1,000 years' time. But they won't be an issue for either the local police or whoever this person is that went around digging things up. They could have been a metal detectorist, or they had an excitable dog that dug things up or whatever, I don't know. But they've been returned with due offerings and prayers and so forth. That's what's prompted me to think about this issue of offerings, and it's something that almost all pagans, there are some who don't, but almost all pagans engage in offerings of some form or other. Wiccans, heathens, Cometics, Hellenics, and Druids, and various other types of pagans as well. Some people, when they first come to paganism, pose the question of why? Why do you make offerings? What's the point? And there are a number of points to think about, which is what I'm going to start waffling around now, as I stir my fudge. Some of the points worth considering and contemplating are we make offerings to our gods, particularly those of us who are polytheists, who believe in more than one deity, because we don't have the same underlying theological assumption necessarily of full ownership that you will find in monotheism. So within Christianity, Judaism, Islam, a number of other religions, Sikhism and so on, there is a single deity who created and in effect owns every single thing in existence. And you can understand from that point of view, if that's your theological mindset, the notion of an offering does seem a little bit bizarre. How can you give someone a thing that they own already? It's kind of would be like going into somebody's house, picking up the slippers off the floor and saying, I'm giving you these. And they'd think, thank you. Why are you giving me back something I have in the first place? That would be strange. But that only is strange if you start from the position of belief that every single thing in the cosmos is created by and owned by one or potentially more deities. A lot of the older polytheist traditions, the ones that modern polytheist ones tend to be based upon, didn't always have a sense of a creator being. Some of them had a demiurge, an entity which pre-existed and shaped the universe. But others either have a whole set of beings, like the Egyptian story, where this god creates that thing and some other god creates some other thing. A number of beings who create bits of this and bits of that and bits of the other, or the universe comes into being and the gods emerge as a consequence of it, which to some extent is also the creation myth within Egypt as well, in that there are some things that pre-exist the Negeru, the gods, and other things which they then, having come into existence, create. So not everything is created by deity, or therefore, in a sense, if you like, owned by deity. And even where there are things that are, this thing is created by that deity, therefore it is not created by this other deity. So if you want to think of it in that sense of, you could give an offering to a deity of something which they have not created, therefore it is not theirs. And so the presentation of a gift, traditionally when we give gifts to human beings, you don't give someone a thing that they already own, or you don't find an artist and give them their own painting, or an author and give them their own book. You give them something that is not theirs. That's the underlying notion of giving. It does, of course, have a presumption within it of ownership. And there are some cultures in which, small tribal cultures usually, in which no one person owns anything. So you have a kind of a collective sharing of goods. So the idea of giving something to someone and it then becomes their possession, not anybody else's possession, just their possession, wouldn't work with some cultures. It only works with others. Certainly the European polytheist cultures of centuries past that I can think of have had that sense of ownership, that there are some things which belong to a particular person, and therefore the act of giving, placing something from your possession to their possession, makes sense. What is the purpose of that giving? Let's say you have given fudge. I'm not going to give this fudge to anyone, I'm just going to eat it because I'm a greedy bastard. But let's say I was overwhelmed by a spirit of unexpected generosity and I decided to give some of this fudge to somebody else. What do I expect them to do with it? Well, generally speaking, I expect them to eat it. I suppose they could throw it in the bin or give it to their dog or something or another. Once it's out of my possession, once I've given it to them, I no longer really have any say, any influence over what they do with it. So if they don't eat it, if they say to they get home and say to their other half, I've just been given this fudge, I don't like it, would you like it? That's their choice. I can't complain to say, I gave you that fudge, you didn't eat it. That would make no sense. But I have some assumption that they will enjoy it, that they will utilise it. I could be wrong in that assumption. Maybe they're on a diet and they don't want to eat it. Don't like the taste of it or whatever. But I assume that the object that I have given is something that will be appreciated and, in some sense, used by the person to whom I have given it. Now, is the act of giving to a deity or an ancestor or a wight, a local genius loci, or whatever the entity may be, is that act of ritualistic giving fundamentally any different from the act of giving to another human being? In most of the cultures, certainly the ones that I'm familiar with, the answer to that question is no. It is basically the same thing, in that you give whatever it is that you're giving because you believe the person, the being, the entity you are giving it to will like it, will want it, will use it in some way. So if you are giving an offering of wine or mead or beer, as in the same sense that you'd give a bottle of beer to another human being, you'd expect them to drink it and enjoy drinking it. And that would be your hope. So in the same sense, if you're pouring out some wine for your ancestors in an ancestral ritual, you are kind of expecting them to drink it. Now, clearly, unless you're amazingly psychic and you can see the ghost of your great-great-granny manifesting to guzzle the wine as it pours upon the earth, they're not consuming it in quite the same way that those of us who are flesh and blood would consume it. They are partaking of it in some other sense. But there is a notion that they are gaining from it. Now we can see with, for example, early Irish, ancient British cultures, examples of objects, swords, spears, shields, jewellery, that sort of thing, being placed into bodies of water, lakes and rivers. In the act of, let's say, placing a sword, for argument's sake, in water, we can only now guess at what might have been in the minds of some tribesman, some druid or warrior or whoever it was 2,000 years ago. So we don't know for a fact, but we can hypothesize what might have been going on in their minds when they made that offer, that decision to place it in the river. Were they expecting the spirit of the river, or their ancestors, or whomsoever the offering was made to be in the water and stretch out an arm like the Lady of the Lake in Arthurian myth, take the sword and go with it into their spirit realm and use that sword in battle? Possibly they did. Possibly there was a sense that having given it, the spirit would somehow be able to receive it and utilise it in some way. That it would become their property, so that if they went to battle fighting the monsters of the other world or whatever the thing may be, and there's lots of Irish and Welsh and so on mythology about giants and ogres and the Vimori and all sorts of horrible monstrous things that need to be battled and fought. There are lots of these tales of fighting. So maybe there was a genuine belief that this sword would be somehow transmitted into the hands of a supernatural entity, a deity, a spirit, an ancestor, whoever, who would then be able to utilise it as a sword, as a weapon, in the battles that they would be fighting in their world. Likewise, any other object that you might imagine somebody offering up and giving, there is in the head of the giver an assumption at some level, whether it's a food offering, a drink offering, a sword, a spear, I don't know, some in the modern day context, a mobile phone, who the hell knows, that the being to whom they are giving it wants it, likes it, and will have a use for it. That's at one level. There are other aspects to offering, and I'm not saying that one approach is the correct one and the others are not, because you can give something for a multiple level of reasons at the same time. So more than one motivation can be true. And some cultures, maybe certain motivations are higher up the agenda than others. in terms of why people make offerings and give them. So one thing to think of, and this may well apply in the Druid context of ancient Britain and Ireland and so forth, is that the act of giving, yes, it may then be utilised by a spirit being in some other dimension, but it also takes it out of this dimension. And perhaps that's why they were placing things on the bottom of lake beds and river beds, where no other person, in theory at least, would be liable to, no other human would be liable to jump in and fish it out and use it for their own purposes. That object was no longer to be used by a human being. It was gone, to all practical purposes at least, until some archaeologist 2,000 odd years later dug it up again unexpectedly, but it was gone from human usage into somebody else's usage. You could say the same where Egyptian tombs were filled with a whole variety of objects. Those objects, once the tomb was sealed up, and yes, I do know that some Egyptian priests were very, very naughty and broke into tombs and nicked the very things that they had a fortnight earlier put in there. More for them. But generally speaking, most people thought once the tomb door was sealed, the objects in there, the jars of ointment, the golden jewellery, all the wonderful things we now see in museums, would never see the light of day again, would never be utilised by a living human being ever again. They would be in the realm of the dead or the realm of the gods or somewhere at any rate, but not with us. So there comes a sort of intention to put that object beyond human usage, which is what I've done obviously with the items that whoever it was that put them there in the first place. I have now tried to put them in a location close to water where I don't think it's at all likely that anyone else will go and dig them up. They are gone from human usage, which I suspect is what the person who put them in the earth originally had hoped. Why might you want an object away from the usage of other human beings? A whole raft of possible reasons. It could be, as with the Egyptian tomb burials, that some particular object was so strongly associated with a person who has now died that you don't, rather than leaving it as an item of inheritance to the younger generations, people might feel that thing should really no longer, now dear old Uncle Fred has popped his clogs, nobody else should be using it. It should be gone from the realms of the living and stay with dear old Uncle Fred in wherever dear old Uncle Fred has gone to. So that's a possibility in that sense, that you no longer want it there. Some objects, of course, may have been placed in rivers, in deep pits, which also happened in ancient Britain and on the continent and Gaul and places like that. At certain periods they were putting them in water, at other periods they were digging very deep shafts in the ground pits and placing them at the bottom of the pits. The kind of upshot is much the same in both cases. They are gone from daily usage. You might put an object in that position because you are wary of it in some way. You see that object as cursed, as having bad luck to it, as being a problem, and you want that problem out of your day-to-day life. So you want it at the bottom of a pit where no one else is going to be placed at any risk of that object. So some of these may not have been loving gifts passed on to the next one. Some of these may have been people taking something that they thought was a real nightmare for whatever reason, and thinking, we don't want this around us. Please, you gods, you spirits, you whatever, please take this away from us and deal with it, because we no longer want it around us. So sometimes there may have been those sort of slightly hammer horror reasons motivating people's decisions to give something away. The act of giving in itself, moving on to a slightly different thing, we can say is good not only for the person receiving it, but also for the person giving it. Those of you with children might sometimes struggle to get them to see why it's good to give things away. You've just bought a present in a shop and you say, oh, this is for your cousin, and they go, oh no, I want it. I don't want to give it to my horrible cousin, I want to keep it for myself. And you have a bit of maybe an uphill struggle explaining to them that no, it's actually a really nice thing to give this to somebody else rather than just constantly thinking in terms of I want, I want, I want. It helps you to be less selfish, to think about that cousin, that auntie, that next door neighbour, whoever it might be. What do they like? What would they enjoy? Let's think about someone who is not us and decide what they would really like, and then go and find it, or make it, or whatever, and then give it to them. That we have invested time in some other person, and you know, I dare say some of you may have been given Christmas gifts, or birthday gifts, or Valentine's gifts, or what have you, and you look at it and you get the impression that the person who's giving it to you has probably put maybe about 5 seconds of thought into it. They've just blundered into a shop, grabbed the first bit of old crap on the shelf, say, oh, that'll do, and given it to you. And it's nicer to have something that you feel that person has really put some thought into, has really considered your likes. Even if the thing they've given you is quite expensive, if you got the sensation that they just picked the first thing on the shelf, which happened to be expensive, and gave it to you in an old this'll do attitude, it's not as nice as if they've spent a little bit of time and bought you something a quarter of the price, but which you will really like, and they knew you would really like, because they really sat and they thought about you, and they like your taste. Well, they know your tastes. They've got a sense of who your favourite author is, who your favourite band is, or something, and they've made a significant effort to find the thing that you would like, that you would want. And it's that putting in of an effort that's important. And not only can you do that with another human being, you can do it with a deity, with an ancestor, an animal, guardian spirit, or whatever it might be. Some entity that you sat there and you thought, right, we want to conduct this ritual to give thanks to Knunos for protecting a local woodland from those buggers with their fracking machinery coming along and destroying everything in sight. What would Knunos, if you're unfamiliar with him, he's a god associated with forests and wild animals, what would he like? And you sat there and you've ummed and you've ahed, and maybe there's a group of you and you all said, oh, I think you'd like this, and somebody else said, oh no, I think you'd like that. Maybe you've gone off and meditated under an oak tree and you've had a sudden flash of inspiration, a vision, and thought, what he would like is this thing, X. And then between you, you've made it or bought it from a shop or done whatever you've done. You've put a real effort into that. And that's what's valued, that you sat, and that act of offering is a way of thinking about the deity or other being that you are giving to. This is where I wish I knew where my sugar thermometer was. Unfortunately, it's gone walkabout, like so many other things, so I'm going to have to try with this and hope for the best. It's a meat thermometer. But there we go. So that may be what you are aspiring to do with the giving of a gift. That's just another thing. You're expressing your consideration of another being. You're using it as an opportunity to think about that other being, what they might like, what they might dislike, what they might appreciate. All of those sorts of things you're taking into account. Right. There we go. making a right mess of this. The other aspect to think of, sorry, I was phasing out there for a second. The other aspect to think of, particularly when it comes to offerings that are associated with food, with drink, with storytelling, recitation of poetry, singing of songs, playing of music, is that there is an aspect of hospitality behind those. And in a number of ancient cultures, we know that when honoured guests were invited to come along and visit the chieftain of the tribe, a common practice was to invite that honoured guest in, give them food, give them mead, wine, beer, whatever it was that people were drinking. Right, okay, I think we're there. Do those sorts of things. Get the bard or the skald or whoever it was to sing songs, to recite poems, to tell stories, to make a fun occasion of it, to display a sense of honour to the individual by making them welcome, by expressing hospitality. To put it in slightly biblical terms, it was slaughtering the fatted calf. You go and get the necessary food, drink, forms of entertainment, whatever it might be, that you feel your honoured guest will particularly like and particularly appreciate, and you share it with them. And it is a sharing, so it's a, you have some and they have some, and it's an act of, well, communion, in the sense that it becomes companionship, from the French origin of the notion of companion, someone with whom you break bread. There is something special, something sacred about sharing food, sharing drink, sharing entertainment with another revered individual. Whether that individual is some chieftain from down the road, or whether they are a goddess or a long since dead ancestor, or the spirits of the forest round the corner, whoever it might be, that act of sharing becomes a means of making community. But they become part of your community because you have shared with them. You have broken bread with them. So it takes on a particular significance which might be lost on a lot of modern people, because we don't always necessarily view things in the same way these days. So it's trying to get into that ancient mindset that you are sharing something that is yours, because not everything is possessed by a single central deity. You're sharing it because it helps you to develop a sense of generosity, a sense of consideration for others, a sense of thoughtfulness, a wish to engage with another being, living, dead, or otherwise. I'm not sure I've got all of this quite long enough. There we go. Put that on for a little bit more. And you're giving at one level in order to make a link. You could make the argument, it sounds slightly jaded and cynical, that the act of sacrifice, the act of giving, is in the hope of getting something back. There is an old Roman phrase that was used in rituals in ancient Rome, all over the Roman Empire: I give so that you may give. The act of giving places a an expectation of reciprocity, that you'd like a good harvest from the gods of the fields. You want the gods of battle to help you succeed against your enemies. You want the gods of healing to help overcome a plague that's sweeping the land, something in that vein. So you give them something, and then they give you whatever, well, you hope they give you whatever it is that you've asked for in exchange. It doesn't always work quite as effectively as that, clearly. History is knee-deep in examples of people, nations, tribes, communities who've offered all manner of things and not got the thing that they asked for in exchange. The cynical might say that's because no one is actually listening. Others might suggest that if every side is praying to the same, which is often the case in monotheism, every side is praying to the same deity, then clearly the deity cannot give both sides victory, not in the conventional human sense of the word at any rate, and that maybe sometimes the thing we've asked for is not something that can be readily provided. We're asking maybe for the wrong thing, that instead of asking for the absolute destruction of our enemies, we should be asking for peace and harmony to break out so that enemies become friends, and that sort of thing. So you could reflect on it in that way, that you've got to be sensible about what you ask for. But nonetheless, the act of sharing and giving becomes that means of establishing a relationship with the being to whom you have given. It's inviting them in, it's making them part of your community in some sense. It is placing a degree of obligation upon them, and of course, as with inviting another human being around for dinner, just because you've invited them doesn't oblige them to turn up. So it may be the case that a group, whether an ancient group or a modern one, makes an offering to some deity or ancestor or whoever it may be, who really doesn't want to know. He doesn't want to be part of that community. And so the offering is made and it just sits there, unreceived. A number of ancient cultures, having made an offering, would engage in some form of divination to try and work out whether or not, by the flight of birds or looking at the stains made by the wine as it was splattered upon the altar, something in that vein, to try and work out whether that offering had gone down well, whether it had been acceptable to the beings to whom they had offered it, which is perhaps another way of saying, did those beings want to be part of that community or not? And that's something that modern pagans can think about as well, not just the making of offerings, but taking some time, be it through meditation, through prayer, through the casting of the runes, through whatever it might be that they want to do, to find out how well received the offering they have made has been, whether that entity wants to establish a relationship or not. Not all will, obviously. Which brings us back to the bit I was talking about earlier about the consumption and usage of offerings. How do you know if you leave out some cake? You leave some cake out on the altar in your garden or your woodlands, wherever it may be, as an offering to the spirits. How do you know they have accepted it? So if you go back the next day and it's gone, does that mean that some spirit snuck up in the night and had a nibble? Or does it just mean that next door's cat came along and scoffed a lot? In practice, it could well be next door's cat, obviously. But does that necessarily preclude the idea that the gods, the spirits, whatever they are, have not themselves participated, along with the cat, in consuming whatever the thing is that was offered up? I would suggest, actually, that can be one and the same thing. That things can be consumed, but not necessarily in the way you expect them to be consumed. In Hinduism, in a number of Hindu traditions, there is this quite lovely practice, although you might say it's endemic of a very divisive and unequal society, but in which better off families make food offerings, and they're left out, in one particular instance on the side of a mountain, I'm sure in other locations in other parts of India, and the family says their prayers, they leave out these bowls of rice and bread and what have you. And then the family retreat. They go home, basically. At which point it is widely known that the local poor people, and we are talking very, 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 very poor people, a level of poverty unknown in Britain since Edwardian times, that those people will come out and consume the food offerings that have been left out by the better off family. And rather than people going, oh well, it's not the gods eating it, it's just that bloody lot down the road scoffing it when your back's turned, the assumption is that that is how the gods consume the offerings. They consume them via the mouths and stomachs of the desperately poor people who otherwise might not eat at all that day. And I mean, you can sort of interpret that sociologically, that this is a way of supporting the desperately poor, maybe not a very effective way, but it's a way of supporting the desperately poor without them needing to beg and having the indignity of it. They can do so in other ways. But is there anything wrong with that notion that if you make an offering to Horus or Heru, you leave out a bit of liver or something, and a local hawk flies down and pecks it up? Why not? Is that not Heru himself? If you leave an offering to Ganesh and some mice, well, you're not allowed to get elephants coming in this country, but mice come along and eat that offering, who are traditionally seen as the Ganesh rides on the back of a mouse in Hindu iconography. That is one of those, that is Ganesh, one of the beings who is consuming and participating in that. So it becomes a way not just of sharing with deity, but sharing with flesh and blood community, whether that's the poor people down the road, whether it's the foxes in the woods, whether it's next door's cat, whoever or whatever it might be. That consumption, that offering is consumed by somebody somewhere and becomes part of a greater cycle, and that is not a sort of jaded rationalisation. That is what the whole purpose of offering is about. And understanding that is key to understanding the nature of why we make offerings, because we see our gods and spirits in all sorts of ways, in all sorts of manifestations, not just as sort of ghostly ethereal presences that waft past on clouds. They can have quite a physical manifestation too, in that flesh and blood entities become their eyes, their ears, and in some cases their mouths and their stomachs for the consumption of food and drink offerings, or whatever it might be. Anyway, I'm going to try and sort out the mess I'm making of this fudge. And I think that's covered a lot of the things I wanted to say. I'm sure there must be more things I could say that would be a bit more useful, but they can wait till some other time. If anyone does have any questions, do feel free to ask, because it would be nice to get some feedback. Other than that, take care.